What can cave formations tell us about ancient climate on Earth? How far back in time can we reconstruct climate using cave records? And why is this research important? Well, this coming October at the Geological Society of America's National GSA Connects 2025 meeting, there is a field trip and topical session where participants will get to explore multiple cave systems in Texas and hear about the ongoing research in these caves that aims to reconstruct Earth's ancient climate. And today I got to sit down with some of the scientists leading this session field trip to answer all of your cave questions. So let's jump into the conversation.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm going to be one of the leads for both the topical session and the field trip.
I'm Jay Banner. I'm a professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences in the Jackson School of Geosciences at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'll be co-leading the field trip with Alex and attending with great interest the topical session.
Wonderful. And before we jump too deeply into the exciting research that the session will explore and the exciting events that the field trip will have, let's first start with probably a question that I think is on everybody's mind watching this, and that is, how exactly do cave formations like stalagmites and stalactites tell us about past climate?
Sure. Well, speleothems in general, which stalagmites and stalactites are particular kinds of, formed from dripping water coming into the cave. So our goal is to figure out from what gets encoded in this mineral formation, how much of that water signal is encoded in the calcite, and how much does that water signal then reflect what was maybe happening in the atmosphere above the cave. So that's the real challenge. And maybe the best way to talk about the geochemical proxies is to talk about the simplest proxy, I think, for someone to conceptualize, and that's a physical proxy of the growth rate, right? So all other things being equal, if it rains more, the water drips faster into the cave, lands on the formation more frequently, so therefore it deposits more calcite in a given amount of time, like in a year, right? On the other hand, if there's an extended drought for years, decades, etc., then the formations will not get dripped upon as much, and they'll grow more slowly. That's kind of like how tree rings work too, if we're familiar with that. But now the chemical proxies potentially yield more information, but they all come with their complexities. We can get into the complexities later, but simply there are things like the isotopes of oxygen, which is in the rainfall, the H2O, and it winds up getting into the calcite of the stalagmite, which is CaCO3, right? That oxygen isotope signal from the rain may get incorporated into the layers of the calcite year by year as they grow. And it may tell us about how much rain there is, the temperature of the rain, and other factors that can change the oxygen isotope signal, if you will, during the meteorological cycle. And then there are other geochemical proxies, such as trace metals, things like strontium, magnesium, that substitute for the calcium in the CaCO3. And the way they substitute is dependent upon what's happening as raindrops flow through the soil, then through the limestone above the cave, then finally in the cave, and as it's flowing over formations on the ceiling before it drips off. All of these can change by various factors of reactions between that water and minerals, could change the amount of those different elements. And then there's another isotopic system we apply quite a bit. It's the strontium isotope system. Unlike rainfall, the strontium isotopes there's very little strontium in the rainfall, unlike oxygen. So the strontium that winds up getting into the cave comes from the soil or the limestone. And the soil and the limestone have different isotopic signals. And we actually use that to reconstruct what the flow paths are. A very fast flow path through the limestone that may happen during very wet periods may only pick up largely a soil signal. On the other hand, during a very dry period, the water tends to follow very diffuse or spread out through microscopic tortuous pore pathways. And that gives it ample time for that water to react with the limestone. So then the water may have more of a limestone signal. So that's sort of an independent way to tell dry from wet periods. We use all these geochemical proxies and use them as sort of independent checks on each other. And hopefully they all give us the same answer. Then we're onto something.
So cool. And is it just like dry versus wet periods, or can we reconstruct other parameters of past climate?
Yeah, there's other kinds of parameters that can be constructed. Can be temperature, for example. It could be the source of the moisture. In Texas, we have multiple sources of moisture, even evidenced in the catastrophic floods of last week. We had moisture coming from the Gulf of Mexico, moisture that was coming from the Pacific Ocean. And we think through the distinct oxygen isotope signals of those two ocean sources, we could actually tell which source was dominant for a given period of time in the past.
Wow, that is just insane. And so how far back in time can we reconstruct climate using cave records?
Yeah, so for cave mineral deposits, speleothems in other words, we use a isotopic dating method called the uranium-238 series. So it's a series of radioactive isotopes, all naturally occurring. And from the radioactive decay and the measurements we can make on individual growth layers, we could date these layers with great accuracy and precision for a lot of the late Pleistocene time period and the Holocene as well. Once we get back past about 500,000 years, it becomes not that accurate to apply that methodology. But the last 500,000 years is a lot of climate change that has happened and that has been recorded in these speleothems. Going back much further than that is a big challenge anyway, because caves tend to get filled in, destroyed. Tectonic processes, burial processes tend to overtake when we get on the multi-million year time scale.
That is so interesting. As somebody who did paleo research in much deeper time, millions and hundreds of millions of years reconstructions, it's a different world when you get into that recent and that specific of changes. That is super cool.
Yeah, what time scales or areas did you study?
I did, paleoceanography, proxy research, reconstructing 500 plus million year old ocean chemistry. So it was much different, but using ocean sediment, not cave formations. So
yeah. Got it. Okay. Yeah. But it seems like you have at least one sample from your study. Is that octopus back there?
Oh yeah. I got that trilobite actually at last year's GSA Connects, and then the dog is not a stuffed animal, but
oh, okay.
She just looks dead right now, but
she could be mistaken as a proxy.
Yeah, no proxy there. Very, very recent, at least. Okay, so awesome. I think now we have a good, basic understanding of how we reconstruct climate using cave formations. So with that, let's now jump into kind of the title of this topical session, because I think it would be helpful if we kind of broke down some of the terms. So the title, Monitoring the Vadose Zone and Karst, Advancing Studies of Paleoclimatology, Hydrogeology, and Biogeochemical Cycling. A lot of those terms are probably, not super widespread in just general language. So for people who aren't familiar with terms like karst, vadose zone, hydrogeology, and biogeochemical cycling, could you just tell us briefly what those mean and why they're important?
Yeah, so karst is in general any landscape that dissolves. So karst forms in places where the bedrock is very easy to dissolve. So things like limestone, gypsum, those are really common karst formers. And it's more of a landscape. So it's not just cave formations. It can be sinkholes where you have sinking streams. It's all of these different things that come together to form this landscape in which these caves form. The vadose zone in general is the section of the bedrock that is not fully saturated. So there's kind of two areas. There's the vadose zone and there's the phreatic zone. So the vadose zone means that the pore space isn't fully saturated, and the phreatic zone means that the pore space is fully saturated. The reason that the vadose zone is so interesting to us is because there's really strong gradients, and it's relatively understudied as compared to the fully saturated zone. And not to mention, it's that connection between the surface and the aquifer that we use for drinking water. Mm-hmm. It's really important to understand what processes are going on in this vadose zone, to be able to understand how things move from the surface down to aquifers. Hydrogeology. So hydrogeology is when you take a combination of geology, so common things like stratigraphy, where you're looking at what makes up the rock, what kind of pore space is there, what kind of matrix is there, so what things are making up the rock, and then understanding how water flows through that and how water can affect those different units. And then the last one, biogeochemical cycling. So the vadose zone, I kind of mentioned before, has these really strong gradients, and it's not just with how water moves through, it's all of these different processes and cycles. So not just the water cycle, but also the carbon cycle. So one thing that we're really interested in understanding is how do different biological processes affect the carbon cycle in this really interesting area. So that could be a combination of, the microbes that you're very familiar with. It could be things like, how do roots affect the vadose zone? So a lot of trees will extend their roots through the vadose zone to try to get access to more water. But in turn, they have a huge effect on how water moves through and how different gases move through the vadose zone.
Wow, that is so cool. So how exactly does one monitor the vadose zone in karst, and what does that tell us?
So one thing that's really awesome about karst is it forms caves. And so when we go into a cave, especially a cave that's not fully submerged, it's in that vadose zone, you're actually stepping into the vadose zone of an aquifer. And so this gives us a lot of insights into how things are going through the vadose zone. So if you think about it, a cave is just a really big pore space. And so we're walking in and we can do all of these different studies. And so one thing that we do a lot of is we do a lot of cave monitoring. And so we'll go through and we'll take atmospheric measurements. So one gas that's really important is carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide controls a lot of the carbonate equilibrium. So that controls how stalagmites form or how they don't form. And that also affects how water will dissolve the bedrock around. So CO2 is really important for us to study, but we'll also study things like relative humidity, which affects several different proxies in different ways, especially like oxygen isotopes. The way that the water will evaporate can affect how the signal is preserved in stalagmites. We also do a lot of drip collections. So the actual stalagmites are forming from drips, and so we'll collect that initial water that's forming that. And then finally, one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing are collecting modern stalagmites. And the way that we do that is we'll go to where water is dripping and we create these basically 10 by 10 centimeter or 4 by 4 inch. They're these glass plates that we sandblast. The reason that we sandblast them is because it forms basically a rough stalagmite surface. And so we'll go and we'll place this out underneath one of the drips. And every time that a drip hits, it's going to form a little bit of that calcite that forms that stalagmite. And we can take those back to the lab and we can analyze them. So we can do things like, okay, how much calcite grew this month or over 2 months? What kind of chemical signals are being preserved in them? So what do our trace metals look like? What do our oxygen isotopes look like? And what we can do is we can start to use this modern calcite to calibrate our past records. So we spend a lot of time going through and we say, okay, let's say it was really hot and it was really dry. Well, this month it's been pretty wet. But we can go and we can say, okay, what was the chemical signals being preserved in this calcite? And then when we go and we start looking through our stalagmites, we can say, okay, I see this chemical signature that looks just like I saw last month when it was really hot and really wet. So I can start to piece together a lot of the paleoclimate stuff with a context of the modern setting. A second way that we monitor the vadose zone, and this has been a really new and exciting way to study the vadose zone, is they're called these vadose zone monitoring systems. And the co-lead of the session, Miel, is very familiar with these. And one of the ways that we monitor the vadose zone is we'll install these angled horizontal boreholes. And along these boreholes, there will be these little cups that suction into the rock above. And so what happens is you can actually pull not only gas, but water out of different sections of the vadose zone from the surface all the way down to your area of interest. And so this has become a really exciting way to be able to look at the vadose zone because it gives you really high resolution data. If we're going into our cave, we're looking at just what's in the cave. But the vadose zone monitoring system, these VMS systems, they can look at discrete intervals all the way down, and they can get every single gas sample. They're collecting raw gas samples. They're collecting raw water samples. It's really interesting and really exciting, and there's not many of them around the world right now.
Whoa, that is really cool. How recent was that, like that development?
It's been very recent. I think in Texas, we installed 2 VMS systems in the past 3 years.
Wow.
And there's not many other ones. There's a lot of them in fractured bedrock. And that's been one thing that's been really interesting is there's been a lot of studies of the vadose zone in different systems. So fractured bedrock, gravel systems. The vadose zone has been studied relatively commonly. There's been very, very little work done in karst systems. And for the United States, karst covers about 30% of the United States. It provides a significant portion of our drinking water. And so when we're going through and we're looking at, okay, like how well do we have these systems constrained? They're poorly constrained in a lot of the United States and around the world, but they provide much of our drinking water. Until recently, San Antonio was 100% dependent on the Edwards Aquifer, which is a limestone karst aquifer. They've since moved away from that. They've invested in other ways to get water, but for the longest time, it was the largest city in the United States that was 100% dependent on a karst aquifer and 100% dependent on groundwater. So it's really important to be able to understand these karst systems from the surface all the way down to the aquifer.
Wow, that's super cool and super exciting and encouraging for, students out there wondering, is this all figured out or are there new developments helping us learn more? Well, there's clearly brand new developments.
Always.
Very recent, helping us learn more. So, any students interested in this research out there, go see this session. But anyway, yeah, no, I love what you said about the CO2. I feel like CO2 is like, now everybody knows what it is because climate change, but you never think about other things that it affects. I didn't know that it affected how stalagmites and stalactites form. That's really cool. And, what you talked about modern analogs is so important. My research was very dependent on understanding how signatures in the rock record form. And for you, that's cave formations, but we have to know how they form now and how they're preserved to understand what they mean when we see those signatures in the rock record. But that actually brings me to my next question, which is, what are some of the biggest discoveries coming from studying cave systems in Texas? And do they tell us just about kind of local climate reconstructions, or can they give us global climate information about the past?
Yeah, so a lot of work in Texas has been done in a few caves. And if people are interested, we can link some of the papers that have been published on them. But they do tell both local and global climate. So a lot of work has been done in the past 20 to 25,000 years of Earth history. And so one thing in the past between 10 and 20,000 years ago, we went through a large deglaciation. So there were mile-high ice sheets 20,000 years ago over most of North America. And a lot of this ice sheet melted, and it put a massive amount of fresh water not only into the Gulf of Mexico, where we're really interested in, but through much of the North Atlantic. This was a huge North American signal that you see during this time. And so what we see in a lot of the Texas stalagmites during this time is there is a massive oxygen isotope excursion. And so when you talk about oxygen isotopes, ice preserves really light isotopes of oxygen. So a really light, really negative isotopic signal. And what we see is a negative isotopic excursion in the stalagmites. And that doesn't mean that the stalagmites are necessarily recording an ice signal, but they're recording a meltwater signal. So as this ice melts, all of those really light isotopes are going through, let's say, the Mississippi River. They come all the way down, they get pushed out into the Gulf of Mexico. That moisture then moves, it gets evaporated and it moves over Texas, precipitates, and that's how we're recording our signals. And so what we see is a really large excursion during this time. So while we do see regional changes, these are connected to a larger global climate signal during the time. And so one thing that I'm trying to do with my dissertation is I'm trying to use multiple stalagmites across Texas to try to constrain, okay, is this just happening in East Texas? Is this just happening in West Texas? How far does it move back and forth? Do we see this as a global teleconnection? Is this not only influencing meltwater in the Gulf of Mexico, but is also affecting atmospheric circulation? So is it affecting circulation over, the North Atlantic Ocean and the Rocky Mountains? What kind of gradients do we see? So yeah, we do see a lot of local changes and regional changes, but these are all connected to the global climate system.
God, that's so cool how you can look at these cave formations and know about not just the global environment and climate changes that were happening 20,000 years ago, but also kind of like local precipitation patterns. I mean, that's just insane.
So, Rachel, I just want to follow up and using words like cool and insane in your reaction to all of this. I often like to just, set my mind thinking that is pretty clear from the data we've reconstructed is that there were these water molecules start in the ocean. They evaporated, right? They then precipitated onto these ice sheets, the mile-high ice sheet that Alex was referring to, right? Then it warmed. So now the H2O is locked in the ice. Now it's warming. Now it's melting. It's coming flushing down into the Mississippi, into the Gulf of Mexico, where it's warming up, right? That same water molecule, that same H2O, right? Some of them are H260 now, some of them are H218 now, but that same group of water molecules is now evaporating from the Gulf of Mexico, being transported landward, precipitating once it gets a little cooled by the elevation increase on the Edwards Plateau, rains, infiltrates it through a crack in the ground into this cave, precipitates 15,000 years ago on a mineral formation, That's those same molecules of water, right? Tagged by their isotopes is kind of insane and cool to think about.
Oh yeah, that is. Isotopes are just a lot of people call them tracers, and it's because that's what they do. They trace this history of like this single water molecule, and they're so abundant in not just the oxygen isotopes, but so many different isotope systems that tell us so many different histories of how these rocks and cave formations formed and what was affecting that and what the world looked like. That's how you just walked through that. It's so cool.
Kind of mind blowing. Yeah.
And it's probably, based on my assumptions, pretty cool to get to work in cave systems. But I'm curious, what are some of the biggest challenges associated with monitoring and working in these Texas cave systems?
So the challenges include from the very get-go, gaining access to these caves. Most land in Texas is not publicly owned, it's privately owned. So these may be caves on someone's property that they're not interested in people going into for liability reasons. It may be publicly accessible caves, privately owned. So these are show caves, right? Tourism, and that's a great economic boom. So just working with cave owners to explain to them the kinds of information we're getting out of the cave often leads to them understanding and giving us access. And the cave owners we've worked with in Texas are awesome and have been extremely helpful. The research could not have been done without them. Once we get in the cave, we are trying to take samples, make measurements of things back in the lab that are really, really, really small in terms of the concentration in the water or in the calcite. Things like the thorium-230 atoms that grow from the radioactive decay of the uranium-238 that we use to date these formations. If we get a little bit of, cave mud on our sample, which is really hard to avoid, it could compromise the integrity of our measurement because we want to measure what's in the calcite or in the water and not in the cave mud on the floor or something we brought in on our clothes. So we kind of try to set up kind of clean room type conditions in the cave. So that's certainly a challenge. Another challenge scientifically is all this important monitoring stuff that Alex is talking about, that there's going to be this whole session about, right? A lot of it is predicated on this thing where what we're measuring today is simulating what was happening in the past. But if you think about it, as soon as that cave is opened for development, for exploration, once you make that opening, you're potentially changing the atmospheric dynamics in the cave in terms of when and where and how the outside air is coming in, exchanging with the inside air. So we have to be really cognizant of that. And then some of these caves we work in are seeing the footprint of development over them. So how much is that changing the signal of what we're measuring today to use as an analog in the past? Or is the impact of urbanization, which is just so prevalent, is that starting to seep its way, no pun intended, into these caves? So there are many, but we have a whole variety of ways of sort of independently checking on the extent to which any of these things can be happening.
That is so wild to think about. I never even thought about the opening changing the atmospheric dynamics in the cave, but you're right. And, one of the things I was really shocked about when I went and visited a cave for the first time in a long time last year was the algae and plants growing on the walls just because of the artificial lights we put in there. These are dark caves underground where there's no natural sunlight penetrating, and there's photosynthesizing organisms growing because of the light that we've put in there and what we've tracked in. And that just, I can imagine changes the entire biosphere in there, but also the chemistry, how the cave formations grow, and everything they're preserving in terms of signatures that reflect climate. That is wild to think about, just our impact on these caves. And I know I did visit San Antonio recently, and I went to the Natural Bridge Caverns. And I think it was there I saw one of the, I think probably you guys or other researchers, a little plate that was under one of the drips that I imagine was one of those things trying to grow.
That was ours for sure.
God, that's so cool. So I imagine you have to really specifically pick spots that, are going to be not affected too much by the people and the interactions.
Oh, exactly. You have no idea how curious people get. And something that doesn't seem to belong, right? They want to help. Oh, we found this in the cave. We found this glass plate, so here you go.
No! Oh, no. I never thought about that. Oh, God. Help by not touching, please.
Yeah. No, you're right. What you described, caves are very unique and fragile environments. And as soon as we come in, our footprints are very real.
Another thing I'm I'm curious about, just based on my own experience down there, is I visited like Carlsbad and Luray Caverns and other caves in Virginia, and there are, these nice 56-degree Fahrenheit, type beautiful temperate caves. And I thought all caves were like that, maybe naively, but then I went to Natural Bridge in San Antonio. It's so hot. Why is it just because like down there it's hotter? Why are they so hot?
Yeah, well, caves reflect the mean annual temperature of wherever you are, right? Because they're insulated against the atmospheric changes by the bedrock. And yeah, the mean annual temperature here is around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the caves are also very humid because they're very actively dripping. Natural Bridge, for example, is you walk through there and sometimes you feel like you're in a rainstorm, right? There's so many drips. Carlsbad, not so much. So
yeah, because I know Carlsbad is drier. Maybe that's why. Because I'll tell you right now, Natural Bridge did not feel 70. It felt hot. It felt way hotter.
That was a temperature.
We walked out to the 90-degree, in the sunlight outside of the cave, and it felt cooler because it was so much less humid, which is insane. I mean, yeah, the humidity, I think, that's what does it, I guess. Speaking of Natural Bridge, what caves are you guys planning to take participants to for the field trip?
Yeah, so we're going to be going to 2 caves. So the first cave we're going to be going to is Cave Without a Name, which we also monitor. So we monitor 4 caves in the region, and we'll be visiting 2 of them. So one of them being Cave Without a Name, and then we'll have lunch at Natural Bridge Caverns, and we're going to be doing barbecue catered by Natural Bridge, which is awesome. And then we'll be going through Natural Bridge Caverns, and they have 2 caves on their property. So we'll be going to the North Cavern and the South Cavern, which have 2 different monitoring systems. The North Cavern is the quote-unquote older one because that's the one that they discovered first. That's the one with the natural entrance. They spent a lot of time. A lot of cavers have been going out for many years since, long before I was born, and they've been exploring it. And since then, Natural Bridge has developed to become a tourist platform. And then the South Cave has been a recent development, probably in the past decade or 2. They've gone through and they actually discovered a void space with well holes. And so we'll be going and we'll see the original well holes that they punched through to find the cave. And they actually made a large borehole and lowered people down into the cave. And so the first time that they discovered it, they were dropping down through these boreholes, and then they went through later and punched tunnels in to be able to access the cave for tours, things like that. Yeah, so we're going to be visiting 2 caves. They're both spectacularly beautiful, amazing formations, huge rooms in some of them.
Oh, that's so cool. And so are the field trip participants going to get to go anywhere that like normal visitors might not get to go?
Yeah, unfortunately not. But Natural Bridge and or actually just Natural Bridge, they do off-trail tours with visitors. So you can actually sign up to go, and you can be on a rope, and you can go through a bunch of mud in really small spaces. We are not going to be doing that, unfortunately. We're going to be sticking to the tour paths. And we're going to be looking at mostly a lot of our monitoring sites. We're going to be doing a lot of other stuff with some of the vadose zone monitoring kind of ideas that we'll talk about not only in the field trip, but on the technical session.
Okay, so they might not get to go, outside the boundaries of regular visitors, but they'll get experts to tell them about the cool monitoring going on, which is super cool, especially if they come to the session.
It's a lot more friendly to everybody, right? We're not going to be doing crazy stuff in the back of the cave, so anybody can come on the field trip. And even Natural Bridge for their South Cave, it goes down it's like 10 or 20 stories. I mean, it's deep. It's a lot of stairs, but on the way out, they have this. They call it the BAT, the Belt Assisted Transport, and it's literally a conveyor belt that will take you out of the cave. It is crazy. It is crazy.
I have been shocked at the accessibility of a lot of the caves that I've visited recently. Remarkable. I mean, we do have an impact on these caves, but it's nice that many people, regardless of accessibility, can visit and appreciate these beautiful natural formations. That's really cool. And I keep hearing, the more I hear about this field trip, the more I really want to go on this one. But there's so many choices, and I don't know which one to choose.
There's like 30 field trips. It's crazy.
I know.
Yeah, but accessibility is a huge issue. I mean, that's one of the when Jay was talking about challenges associated with monitoring and with doing cave work in general, it's not common to have really well-developed tourist caves. And we do most of our monitoring in tourist caves, but we also do work in non-tourist, quote-unquote, wild caves. And some of these wild caves are difficult to access. I mean, they might have several rappels that are quite large. They might be incredibly small. They might be very wet with waterfalls moving through or stream passages going through. So yeah, when you talk about like non-tourist caves, getting away from the accessibility, you talk about some of these remote wild caves, they can be really big challenges for working in.
Another interesting challenge in these wild caves is that, picture yourself like on the Edwards Plateau. It's a sparsely vegetated landscape, thin soil, rocky, and think back to a Cormac McCarthy novel of just how tough it was to make it across this terrain. And you see these little openings in the ground and they're blowing out cool air. If it's in the summer, the air that's coming out is actually cooler and there's a little bit of shade in there. So not only might a human like to duck in there and look at it as an oasis because there might be dripping water, but other creatures tend to use that as an oasis as well. So some of the wild caves you go to, you know that there's a particular rattlesnake that is living just inside the opening to it. And so, our protocol is pick up 5 rocks and throw them in one at a time to get the snake to, get it a little bit disrupted and angry, and then it moves out of your way.
Or at least it'll make some noise so you know where it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, can listen and, echolocate. No, actually, that brings up another question because I'm curious. I've only been in, tourist caves where they've completely made it, path accessible and put all these lights in. But I was in one where they, turned off the lights to show us what it will look like if there weren't any artificial lights in there. And it's pitch black. So do you guys have headlights and stuff when you try and go into these wild caves?
Absolutely. Yeah. You need not only we each have a headlight, we each have like 3, right? You go in one, back up, and another back up. And then I like to carry around a little mechanical one. You just squeeze it and the frictional force turns a little dial that makes some energy and lights up a little bulb. If you're completely out of batteries, you should always have a fail-safe.
Can't have too many backups.
Yeah, and this does bring up a pretty important thing about caves is that they are inherently dangerous. Show caves, very safe. They're very monitored or very protected, but just wild caves around, they can be very dangerous. There can be drops, pits, there can be moving water, there can be snakes. I was just face to face with a porcupine a few weeks ago in one of these caves. So there are hazards, and there can be, dangerous gas conditions. The atmosphere can be unsafe to breathe. And so if people are really interested in caving, they should really get in touch with their local grotto. So it's GROTTO. And so that's kind of like a local caving club. And so the National Speleological Society, or the NSS, has different local caving groups that if you're interested in caving, you should absolutely get in touch with your local grotto because they have the experts that go into caves a lot and do it really well and really safely. And they'll always be happy to have more people that are interested in caves come out and learn. So if you're interested in caving, I have to put in the NSS plug in there for
Oh, that is so cool. I would love to try that one time. Maybe not squeezing into a tiny space, but a space that people have gone through many times. That I'll do. But
you're coming down to GSA, right?
Oh yeah.
We can make it happen.
Really?
Yeah.
Ooh, okay. I might take you on that.
Off trail at Inner Space. I think that's that's where we should go. For sure.
Yeah, it's super easy. It's up by Austin, so a little side quest to Austin, and then. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Oh, that sounds fun. Okay, well.
I think it was 2015 we ran a GSA trip there. So that guidebook should be available if you want to get a preview of the Inner Space Cavern. Yeah.
Ooh, okay. So been done before. That's good. Okay, last couple questions. What's the main takeaway you hope participants get out of the field trip and the topical session? And you both can answer for the session and the field trip respectively.
I think for the field trip, hopefully there's a range of people, as in previous field trips. There are we hope some of the world's experts on caves come on this trip, right? See what we're doing, interact with us, and in real time. Usually you have to wait until you submit a paper for publication before you get the experts reviewing it. But Alex and I would love to have the experts look at it now, right? Before we actually submit this for publication. Tell us midstream. Give us your ideas. What is unique about this that you could learn and take away for your research that might lead to some collaborative efforts, which it has. People from other countries have seen what we do in these caves, and then when they're putting together their papers, they're comparing it to what we have. So it engenders research collaborations and shares knowledge with experts. But then at the other end of the spectrum, which is all good, are people who maybe are interested but have never been in a cave before,
Yeah.
or are geologists, right? And I think every geologist should go into a cave at some point in their career. I was probably the oldest geologist who had never been to the Grand Canyon. I finally checked that off the list, and I felt like, how could I not have done this and still call myself a geologist? Not quite the same way with caves, but for people who had never been in a cave, I think to just gain an appreciation for just how cool they are. They're awesome. They're beautiful. We'll hopefully turn the lights off at one point so everyone appreciates what it's like to be in total darkness. Hopefully people gain appreciation for the fragileness of these environments, and that we have to always be thinking about how can we sustain these environments because of how rare and important they are.
Yeah. And for the topical session, karst vadose monitoring in general is relatively understudied, and there's only really a few pockets of people that seem to be working on this. Like when I go and I look at the literature, some people are interested in biogeochemical cycling. So they're interested in understanding how do microbes, how do root zones, how does all of these different things affect the vadose zone. But as a paleoclimatologist, I'm also interested in that, but I don't necessarily think about that a lot. So just bringing a lot of different perspectives together to instill, collaborative efforts is kind of the whole idea of this topical session. There are people in academia, there are people that are in industry, there are people in government. We want to bring all of those people together to kind of build up the field. We want to bring the field together. We want everybody to be able to know each other and to be able to know what each other are working on so that we can progress this field relatively quickly, because there's a lot of issues. So we talk about caves a lot, but these caves aren't necessarily super unique. There's a lot of this conduit flow. So when you talk about karst dissolving, this carbonate bedrock dissolving especially, it forms these passages. And you can kind of think of them like sewer tunnels. I guess isn't the best way to think of it, but tunnels, conduits, it's probably the best way to think about it, right? There are these portions of the bedrock in which flow can move really rapidly. And so karst is extremely susceptible to contamination. And so some other work that we're doing is showing that there is contamination that can move relatively quickly through karst systems. And this water can flow extremely fast through these systems, especially where you have fracture flow, that you have faults that are formed. And then when the faults are formed, that creates a really weak zone in the rock. That water can move through fast. And if it's moving through really fast and it can already dissolve really quickly, that's how you start to get these big caves. So especially at Natural Bridge, one of the reasons that the cave is where it is because there's a series of faults that have allowed the cave to become, you start these nucleation sites and it grows really big. So if you think about that, these large passages exist in other places. And so we really have a vital interest to not only understand the water resources, both in water quality and water quantity. We have a vital interest to understand biogeochemical cycling, and we have a really vital interest to understand how they can be used to understand climate better. That's a very
many things. I, naively came into this interview thinking that caves help us reconstruct climate, and that's that. I never even thought about the side of things like contamination, and that makes a lot of sense though now that you say it. So very important research being done. And what you say about bringing scientists and students together to collaborate and, talk about all these ideas, not just in the session, but at the field trip. That's always what GSA Connects is about. So that's always what I get out of it. If you're a student out there or researcher of any kind, coming and being part of one of these sessions or being part of a field trip or just presenting a poster is just so helpful for, like you said, Jay, having that interaction with the experts before you submit for publication. It can save a lot of time when, the review comes back. So absolutely, the collaboration part of things is such a big part of GSA Connects. And so that brings me to my last question. What are kind of the major outstanding or unanswered questions in cave research today, and how can students get involved in this research?
It's a really tricky question. There's so many different ways that cave research can continue to move forward. I think we're both probably more on the paleoclimate side of things. And so there's a lot that can be done with paleoclimatology. So pretty uniquely, caves can provide really high resolution records of past climate. Jay was mentioning that it can go all the way back to 500,000 years ago. And especially when you talk about more of the recent timescales, the timescales that we're interested in, is you can get really, really incredibly high resolution records. And that's one thing that we're working on and a lot of other people are working on is, well, how high resolution can you get? Can you get down to annual resolution? Can you get down to subannual resolution? I think there's other proxies that can start to do that in the terrestrial setting. You can get lake sediments that can do that. You can get tree rings that can do that, but they both have their issues. And don't get me wrong, caves and stalagmites also have their issues. But I mean, with tree rings, you get precisely dated annual resolution or subannual resolution, but you're only going back maybe a few thousand years. With lake sediments, you can go back a lot further, but you might have issues with your actual laminations and your resolution that way, right? So you might not get your annual resolution. So caves can kind of hopefully be this in between where you can get longer time intervals, and sometimes you can also get high resolution records that can produce from that. Some other things,
multi-proxy approach,
Yeah, these multi-proxy approaches, and they can kind of caves fill in these gaps that aren't necessarily, there. Like Texas has no natural lakes. So we have no lake sediments. And so we can use not only cave formations, but there's been some really interesting work done with cave sediments where caves can accumulate these sediments. So you have a void space in the rock and it fills up with sediments over time. And those sediments have been shown to be very good recorders of climate as well. And so there's a whole bunch of other aspects of hydrology that you can answer or start to answer with caves. So a lot of people are really interested in understanding how do caves push water through quicker, right? And so what a lot of people are doing is they're using caves to map out these conduits. They're diving into the caves and they're mapping them to not only understand, okay, well, one, these caves are really cool and we want to go into these caves and see where they go, but also how do they affect water flow? How do they affect our drinking water? So where is this water moving? How does it move through these conduit systems? How do contaminants travel through? How do these different water sources mix in these caves? There's all of these different questions that you can ask about your water resources through caves.
Yeah, in terms of how students can get involved in this kind of research, go to the caves. You don't have to go along with a PhD level researchers into a cave. A lot of these tourist caves have really good, well-informed tours. They talk with us about our results, so they are actually helping disseminate our results to the general public in terms of, how fast do these things grow? How old is it? How can you tell something about the past climate? So go into a cave. There's nothing like seeing something in the field. Yeah. One other thing you could do if you're really interested, look into becoming a geoscience major or environmental science major. Go to a meeting, say like the Geological Society of America conference coming up in San Antonio this October. Sign up for a field trip, go to a topical session, and actually go up to talk to some of these researchers who you think are doing research that's in line with where your interests are. Don't be shy about meeting them. Then you'll be like me when I was a teenager. I would never go up to an adult and ask them about their research, I would say, don't be like me. Go up and talk to these scientists, these researchers, find out how you could do more and get involved.
Absolutely. Yeah, I my first few conferences, I was very nervous to go up and talk to people, but now that I've done more of it, I've learned that everybody that I've talked to, especially in the geosciences, is just so excited to talk about what they research. So, I mean, it's never a lose situation. You're always going to win from that because they just want to tell you about it. And if you want to hear about it, it's the perfect place to be is at these conferences.
Your only regret may be if you do all of that is that you may not be able to get us to stop talking about it. So.
True. That's absolutely true. So, risk versus reward.
Right.
Thank you guys so much for coming on.
Thank you, Rachel.